How you doing, guys? I moved into this small town some 30 years ago. And while I was here, I had noticed as small of a town as it had a relatively large population of homeless people. Funny thing was, everybody in the community accepted them as part of the community, and in reality they were. I was quite visible around town, so I got to know quite a few of them. And the one thing I had noticed, each one of them were able to take advantage of certain provisions that were there. A lot of the churches in the area would have community dinners throughout the week, and each one of them knew where to go, no matter what day of the week it was. Being homeless is something that has always scared me. Now, I've been at financial highs and I've been at financial lows, but always managed to keep my head above water. Getting to know a lot of them and seeing how they were living kind of scared the hell out of me. So I was never beyond working 2 and 3 jobs just to keep myself afloat. I primarily, when I moved here, was in the restaurant industry. For anybody who's worked in the restaurant industry, you find it's a very thankless business. Now, my days more often than not would start at 8 a.m., and a lot of times I wouldn't finish till well after midnight. This is not just in one restaurant. This was in every restaurant that I had worked through over the years. It was about the early 2000s. I had gotten so burnt out of the restaurant industry that I just needed away. I had to get away from it. I had hooked up with somebody that was in the neighborhood who had a marine construction company, so I started working with him. I figured I'd work with him a couple of jobs just to pay the bills, and then I'd go back into the restaurant business. Didn't end up that way, as I was doing that for about 7 or 8 years. As a matter of fact, I was still doing that when I started studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. The first thing they liked to push is how charitable they were, that Watchtower was a charitable organization. One thing that was pushed was when there was a natural disaster in the area, Jehovah's Witnesses from all over the country would mobilize and assist. It didn't dawn on me at that time. But over the next few months, I started realizing exactly what they were saying. To gain assistance from Jehovah's Witnesses in a natural disaster or any kind of disaster, you had to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The other thing was any monetary assistance, labor, or supplies came from Jehovah's Witnesses, not from Watchtower, although Watchtower did take credit for it. But the funny thing was, when these Jehovah's Witnesses who had been assisted by other Jehovah's Witnesses received their insurance checks, they would send them off to New York, to the worldwide headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, when I started studying, they kept pushing that charity thing, and in the back of my mind, I was thinking they were doing the same thing as these other churches. And come to find out, no, they really weren't. And I was wondering exactly how do they constitute themselves as being a charity. And I had asked that several times, and when I found out that they were actually considering the preaching work charity, and in all honesty, it is not, because not everybody accepts that message at the door, and once they do, no, you can count no assistance whatsoever from Jehovah's Witnesses. In the back of my mind, I realized that Watchtower, over the years, that Watchtower had been scamming the system to keep their charity status, their tax exemption, because they were not a charity. And the thing was, this trickled down into the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses, into the mindset of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, the one thing that everybody who has a JW study is on the assumption that their study is down and out and going through hard times or have had a death in the family. This wasn't the case with me. Now, my entire life financially has been a roller coaster. I've had financial highs and I've had financial lows, but even those lows, I always managed to keep my head above water. When I started studying, I was at one of those financial highs. I was living quite comfortably. But my Bible study had the impression that I wasn't doing so well because, well, why else would I be studying with Jehovah's Witnesses if I was doing well? Now, I lived in a quiet neighborhood at that time. I had been there for quite a few years when I started studying. I had my privacy, had a big backyard, had a dog, and life was good. Well, my Bible instructor had a shed in his backyard. that had electric. He was going to cut me a deal. He wanted me to move in to this shed in the back. Although it had electric, it had no plumbing, which means I would have had to have used his house. And since he was married, if he wasn't there, I could not have gotten into his house. I realized this guy was a control freak, and this was his one way of getting me under his thumb. And I'm like, no, I'm living quite comfortably. I had no intention of moving out of the house, and I definitely had no intention of getting rid of my dog. Well, this guy was under the impression that I was going to quit my job so I could go out in the pioneer service with him. The one thing he used to like to push was the fact that he wasn't working. He was in the full-time ministry. And because he was, how he put it, he was working for Jehovah, all his bills were paid, he had everything he wanted. The thing he neglected to tell me was, while he was out pioneering, his wife was working a part-time job to bring in the money. But that didn't last too long. Over the next few years, he kept trying to tell me, quit your job and we'll go out in service. We'll go out full-time service. Now, in my mind, my bills are my responsibility. I can't haphazardly throw caution to the wind. So I realized, no, my job is my job. I'm going to keep my job. I'll go out in the ministry when I can. I had fallen into hard times just prior to my baptism. Well, my job was no more. I was getting baptized that weekend, and I continued on with it, knowing full well that that Monday I would have no job to go to. It was funny how JWs wanted to use that as an example. He lost his job, yet he still went down to the convention center and got baptized. Realization kicked in. I said, I'm going to need me a job. The one thing, when you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I now had compromised myself. In 6 months period, the only job I was offered would require that I carried an M16. Being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I pretty much had to turn that down. And he was still so nonchalant about it. Well, go out in the pioneer service with me. And the back of my mind was, that's fine, but I still need an income. And yet he's trying to put the example that he still was not working, and yet all his bills were paid. He owned his own home. The one thing I didn't realize at that time was he had another full-time job, and that was trying to get disability, which he did eventually get. And looking back on it, his injuries were no different than the injuries I had. Now, let's face it. Most guys, as they get older, depending on the work they do, are going to acquire injuries with time. Now, at the time, I was doing marine construction, which required I was doing heavy lifting. Sometimes 200-pound items on my shoulder, walking over a catwalk. I'm realizing I'm getting older. I'm not going to be able to do that forever. When I get to a certain point that I can no longer do something, I simply don't do it. So what I found out was he is now collecting disability, trying to talk me into doing the same thing when no, I'm still able to work. If I can't do something, I simply will do something lighter. The funny thing was, while he was hobbling around, hardly able to walk, claiming injuries, taking disability, he's down the convention center doing welding and installing AC for Watchtower. He'd be working in his garage, welding in his garage, of course with the door closed so nobody could see him. There was one point he took advantage of one Bible study and they remodeled his kitchen. A couple of times a year, he and his wife would travel down to South America, where transportation wasn't very prominent. And he was telling me how they'd basically be walking for miles with an open Bible. And he'd brag about this when he came back. Yet, down in South America, he'd be walking. Yet when he came back to the United States, he's a hobbling cripple again who needs disability. The one thing I tried to point out was not every job is physically grueling. In all honesty, I thought he was quite capable of doing something rather than raping the system. He liked to refer to it as working for Jehovah. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, no, that's called scamming the system. So, well, where did he learn this? He learned this from the boys in New York. See, Watchtower scams the system, yet they'll condemn other religions, they'll condemn other organizations for doing the same thing. As a matter of fact, he and I used to have conversations about people on the outside of the organization who will file for disability when they really don't need it, and yet he'll condemn them. Yet you talk about one of Jehovah's Witnesses taking advantage of these things, taking advantage, and they call it working for Jehovah. They'll justify scamming the system if they're one of Jehovah's Witnesses. If they're not, they condemn them. In the entire time I've known this guy, he has never once held a job. Yet, because he claims he can't do anything because of his injuries. Over the years, I have got broken body parts, and the older I get, the more I notice them. My knees are shot, my back is a wreck, and my neck, I can hardly move it anymore. Yet I'm still working. To this day, he is not. This is the same guy who 4 years ago was willing to pick a fight with me outside of my place of employment. And what was funny, when I was down and out after I had become one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I went from driving a conversion van to walking, because while I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I was struggling big time to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses. It got to the point where I realized, okay, I'm out in the ministry, but that's not paying the bills. I had been in such a financial hole after I got baptized that I had never been in before. Well, I finally realized, okay, this isn't working for me. I have to put more emphasis on work. So I basically would find jobs where I knew they wouldn't go. When it appeared that I started doing financially better, one of the elders had pulled me aside. We went for a drive. And I was basically telling him, look, this is the deal. I have to put a little bit more emphasis on work. I'm struggling. I'm walking everywhere I go. I can't afford a vehicle right now, never mind the insurance. And he says to me, it's all right. Jehovah appreciates it. While he was telling me this, I'm looking around the vehicle. He has a new BMW, and I'm like, yeah, I'm sure Jehovah appreciates this too. The more time went by, the more emphasis I put on work. They actually had tried to talk me out of quitting my job and finding something else. And I'm like, why would I quit one job to go to another? Either I work here or work there. What does that have to do with anything? But they figured my job I was working at the time was keeping me away from the meetings. And that wasn't the point. I was keeping me away from the meetings. But sitting by and watching the Jehovah's Witnesses, I noticed I wasn't the only one struggling. There seemed to be two different classes of people at the hall. Some were doing financially well, others were struggling like me, and this included elders. And I come to the realization that the two classes of the hall were those that knew and those that didn't. And when I say those witnesses that knew, I'm talking about those that knew the inner workings. The others were kept dumbed down. They were kept broke. They were kept reliant. They wanted you to be reliant on this organization and nobody else. I could just never be that way. But towards the time, up until the time I was DF'd, they kept trying to get me to quit my job. They kept coming in, harassing me, hoping that they would fire me. Didn't work out that way. But my Bible instructor, who was on disability the entire time I pretty much known him, who to this day, I'm sure is still on disability. Well, like I said, he was willing to pick a fight with me outside of where I work, so he couldn't have been that hurt if he wanted to rough and tumble with me. But like I said, they learned this from the best. Watchtower was scamming. They're not a charity. They're a scamming organization, barely able now to hold on to their charity status. And Jehovah's Witnesses, who take advantage of the system, are nothing but scammers. But my message to you, Jeff, maybe the state should take a little closer look into your case. You made my life a living hell for the last few months I was in, and don't think I have forgotten how many times you scammed the U.S. government for money. No, dude, you are quite able to work. Like I said, not every job is physically grueling. I'm sure you could take a job as security somewhere, or work a cash register. But no, you prefer playing would-be wannabe minister, collecting a free paycheck. Shit doesn't work that way, Chief. Anyways, guys, I'd appreciate your thoughts, and I will talk to you soon. You guys have a good day.